Welcome to Mirage. Today we're going to be speculating on Ghost Twain, and who lives on the podcast more than anybody else is Varla Ventura. So I've obviously been looking forward to this very much. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right, thank you. Always good to
Fantastic.
talk with you.
All right. Well, how is the snow in Minnesota right now?
Well, it is summer,
Oh,
but
it is. I didn't think it actually happened there.
yeah, well, basically it just gets hot for a while and then it's fall. So
Does it get hot? Like really, really hot?
it has been actually pretty warm. Yeah, it's been
Yeah.
like 90s, 80s. Um, it's generally, you know what? I don't really know what's going on. I've only lived here a few years, and every single time somebody says, "Yeah, this isn't normal," I was like, "What? This is way colder than normal, or this is way warmer than normal." It's just like, all right, peoples. I know we're up north here, but global warming is a thing.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's actually affecting the what is it, the oceans more than anything else.
yeah, it's just I mean, I don't know, it's always seemed warm to me, but I lived in San Francisco for almost my entire life, and it basically fluctuates between 50 and 60 degrees year round there.
Right. I was
So
surprised. I was so cold. It was like July.
everybody's
I was
cold when they go
freezing.
there. You make if you sell fleeces that say, San Francisco Bay or Golden Gate Bridge, you can make a fortune down by the water as the tourists come thinking they're in California and they're going to wear shorts in summer. And there's a misquote of Twain, actually, perfect segue. There's a misquote of Twain. I guess there's no evidence he actually said it, but he's constantly quoted as having said it. It's the coldest summer I ever spent was the summer in San
Oh yeah,
Francisco.
I've heard that before.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
is
But he did
definitely
spend quite
attributed
a
to
bit of
him.
time in San Francisco, and it's basically a reference to that. The fact that in the summer, summer is not the warmest month there. It's more like February, March, or September.
That dude's a straight up traveler, wasn't he? He went all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
I can't
Yeah,
believe how
he
much time he
did.
spent in Hawaii in the 19th century. I mean, he went there when they had like queens and kings and stuff.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. I don't know a ton about his experience there, but I've done a teensy bit of research into that era of Hawaii before it became a state, and while basically we were, you know, very slowly pillaging all of the the resources there. And during that same time, actually, I have my great grandparents came over, and my grandmother's oldest sister was born in Hawaii, and the story is, the family legend is that they went across from the San Francisco Bay Area, where they had worked the railroads coming across the United States. They ended up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and
Hmm.
like many people at the time, you could basically make a bunch of money or pay off debts if you worked on either a sugar cane plantation or a pineapple plantation. And so
Oh, interesting.
my family legend is that they went there, and she was actually pregnant at the time, working on a pineapple plantation, and had their first child there, and there's some kind of indentured servitude that was paid off, and then eventually they made their passage back to the
Back
San
to
Francisco Bay Area. Yep.
Man, I went to the Dole plantation when I was in Hawaii, and it's not a job I want. It's
Oh,
very arduous. I mean, it's like there's no
yes.
machinery that does it. I don't think you have to do it by hand. You can
Yeah.
pull those pineapples from the ground. They're spiny little bastards.
Bro, they are spiny little bastards. That's quite true. And yeah, it's such a, but if you come across the country working on the railroad,
Right. I mean,
you're
yeah, I guess
it's
pineapples are
like,
going to be
it's
luxurious, aren't
warm,
they?
you're going through the Rockies in the winter or whatever. You're like, oh, this is
Right.
wonderful. And probably my guess is that what happened most often with couples is that the man was a laborer, and then the woman was a laborer, but she did all the camp washing, or she did all the
Gotcha.
cooking or something like that. Which is way more horrible, I think, than the actual labor out in the fields, because you're stuck doing laundry or cooking. So you don't even get to sing.
You could always claim to be a writer, though, right? I mean, just
There you
say,
go.
I'm busy writing my manuscript. Leave me alone. I don't know.
Yeah, that probably didn't. He probably got whipped or something for that.
Oh
So,
man, that's horrible. Where would your family originate from?
um, all over on my mother's side, mostly Italy.
Okay.
Yeah,
So the last name is legit,
yeah. Last name's well,
straight up Italian. What part of Italy?
relatively legit. I mean, um, southern and
Oh,
northern. So southern
oh,
on my grandfather's side and northern on my grandmother's side.
my
And then
family originates
on my
from the
father's
south too.
side, what's that?
My family originates from the south too,
Oh
Naples.
yeah. Oh yeah, me too.
Oh.
OMG.
Well, actually, the
My
Bay of Naples.
people.
The I think the whole story,
A
the thing that brings
village
together.
outside of Naples,
No,
perchance?
no, an
Oh, okay.
island outside of
And
Naples, the Bay of
oh,
Naples,
you were
actually in the Bay of
oh
Naples.
nice. Oh,
And the reason that
nice.
my family came here is they were dying of thirst. They had no water.
Ooh.
They had to escape excruciating agonizing death by
It was very rough times in the south of
yeah,
Italy, especially. There was a lot of, and even in the north, not as much, but we had the Austro-Hungarian Empire sort of creeping down into the northern part of Italy. So that part of Italy also became, Austria and has a more
yeah,
Germanic kind of climate to it. But the southern, I mean, people were looked down upon. The Greeks and the Italians were like, you know, peasant gypsies, and they were
yeah,
basically really just thought to be poor and stupid and all kinds
yeah.
of
I mean, they
things.
had
And
like
so,
what, hundreds of kingdoms or something. They weren't even like solidified under one flag at that point. I can't remember the exact history, but they weren't
yeah, and it was
regarded historically
quite
well.
corrupt, I think, as well. So you have, still kind of corrupt, but you just had
Kind of
people just
corrupt.
kind of corrupt is like a really nice way of saying it. You
They
have
don't
people
kill
just trying
anybody
to,
anymore.
like
They don't
every immigrant story,
murder them
right?
viciously. They don't hang anybody upside down, but
Mm.
they,
Mm. Yeah, but definitely like just it's like it's the same story,
yeah.
different decade. The
This is
trying
what
to
we're
escape
talking about,
abject
though, right?
poverty and
This is what we're
uh,
talking about in terms of like the world during Mark Twain's time, right before he died. This is the world. People are fleeing in mass from places that they lived their entire lives because they're starving, right? There are no jobs. The world is like fresh from World War II. When did he die? 1901, 1912. I want to say 1912.
1910.
1910. So
1910.
World War One is right around the corner.
World War One was right around the corner. He was born in the United States. So I
Yeah,
think
Mark
that's,
Twain.
yeah, Mark Twain was. And so he had, he was one of the, probably like the first generation that rose to notoriety that were, born in the kind of, I guess that was the West back then. In 1835 or so, you had Missouri. He was born in Missouri. So Missouri was the kind of western front of how far we had explored. I mean, people had gone out to the West Coast and they were settling in places like California and Oregon, but not until 20 years later was the massive gold rush and the big push. So he was kind of, he was out in the Wild West. And one of the stories that so we kind of touched on this in the previous podcast, and that's this novel that I wrote about in my most recent book, about this novel that supposedly was channeled through the Ouija board via Twain
I find
and a
that so
medium.
cool that he found a way to communicate from Halley's Comet.
Yeah, well, what's funny is I was like reading a few facts about him this morning, and
Uh,
I read that he was born during Halley's Comet, and then I guess that
I love
he
it.
had made this prediction that
Yeah,
he would die during Halley's
it's my
Comet, and
favorite thing
he
about him.
died, and it came back. It was like the next day, everyone could see this comet.
I want
So,
that. I want that to be so
so
true,
crazy.
and I want Halley's Comet to come back when I die.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Not that I'm
probably
gonna. I mean, we're talking about Hales Bob, aren't we? I mean, that's as crazy as that. I mean, basically, we
yeah,
had a group of people in the mid
yeah.
'90s that said, "We want to be on a comet too,
I
Mr. Twain.
remember that.
We're
I
gonna cut our
remember that
penises off." And
vividly. And I remember walking down the street at the time. I lived back in I had moved back to my hometown for a couple of minutes, and I would just remember just brief, and I shall not explain why. But the town is, it's a little town, and you can see quite a few stars from the town. And I remember walking down the street to this apartment I had rented, and looking up and seeing it, and kind of, thinking about, like, all the times before and all the legends and, what was going on in these people at the time. They weren't dead yet, but they were saying, this return of this comet is, significant, blah, blah, blah. So,
Yeah. Man, they did some horrible things to each other. And I mean, I listened to a podcast about it, and obviously I was alive during that time. I was in the army when that happened. I remember specifically I was sitting in one of my buddy's rooms and he had a television and we were watching the news and it popped up. And that comet had been there forever, right? That two-tailed
where were you?
Fort Campbell,
I don't know where that is.
Kentucky.
Oh, okay.
Just right on the border of Tennessee. Yeah, about an hour north of Nashville, or an hour west of Nashville, actually. It was horrible. It was like one of the worst places you could possibly get stationed. When I joined the army,
You didn't get your top pick. No,
I did not get my top pick. I was so desperate to go to Germany. That's why I lived for like a year when my dad was stationed over there. And I was so desperate to go back that I was so disappointed that I didn't get to go. I was like, okay, I'm done with the army now.
Oh,
Spent 3 years just being disappointed.
So my dad's story of how he ended up in Vietnam is that it was, he went to basic training and then they gave him the choice. Do you want to go to Germany or do you want to go to Vietnam? And he didn't want to go to Germany because he thought it'd be cold.
Your dad.
Yeah. And
so he went to Vietnam because he didn't want to be cold.
Yeah, he was 17. He had 1966, I believe.
Oh, that's good.
He was
kind of in a way, right? It wasn't as bad yet.
He had forged, right? No one really. It hadn't all been exposed. Not while he had enlisted. He forged papers. Got his mom to sign something saying that he was 18 or it was okay for him to join.
Yeah.
He joined. He was 17 years old, and
me too. Actually, I was 17. My mom had to sign a waiver for me. I didn't go to basic training for a year, but I was already in the army my entire last year of high school. God, 17 years old.
Young. So young. And then just that you would think, oh, should I go to Vietnam or Germany? I don't want to go to Germany because it's cold.
But you see, that's the thing, isn't it?
I mean, decision that had such long-term repercussions
for that 17-year-old kids. For that 17-year-old kid. I mean, yeah, exactly,
exposed to Agent Orange, PTSD, all kinds of crazy things.
How was your life growing up with him? Was it okay or was it violent, bad?
There were I mean, it was mostly it was not good. Actually, there was a lot of violence, but it was never directed at me. So I didn't grow up in fear necessarily, but I definitely am very familiar with the signs of post-traumatic stress and kind of that not remembering, snapping kind of situation. I was exposed to a lot of that as a kid. My dad was also a drinker, which is really common. And he stopped drinking when I was a teenager. That was the only choice too,
right?
Yeah, I mean,
drink or go to jail.
He used to tell me stories about how they give you this kit, and in this kit you take this out in the field and you open it up, and there was just straight up morphine and a needle in there.
Yeah, you strapped it to your chest.
Carried it with you. Yeah,
you just had it with you. Just in case you got into a firefight, they could use it to stabilize you. And you're bored, right? I mean, firefights, I don't think happen very often. I mean, they happened, yeah. They killed people and watched people die. But majority of the time they sat there bored, right? And they're in holes, digging holes, hurting, walking in trench foot. Oh my God, the pain. And they have
so there was naturally a lot of self-medication. And then, there's a whole host of issues with, coming back and transitioning back into, quote unquote, domestic life. And so, but he got sober, and that made a big difference, and kind of changed the trajectory of our family because of that. So even though there were a lot of problems in my earlier childhood, that, I mean, I'm not going to say it was okay, but there's something about the effort and the tremendous changes that he went through to save his family that kind of made up for it, I guess, so I never grew up with a great deal of resentment for him or disdain for him. Not that there weren't other kind of I mean, I certainly made a lot of bad choices, but what can you do? Everybody makes bad
That's
choices.
life, right?
Yeah.
Everybody makes bad choices.
You won't know they're bad until you've made them.
Isn't that the funny thing? I mean, you might feel like they're bad. Usually the ones that feel the
they
best
feel
turn.
good.
Yeah, exactly.
They usually
The ones
feel
that
so
feel
good.
that way, like a warm bath, run away from those immediately.
Yeah,
They're just gonna
if it
cause you
feels
freaking problems.
good, don't do
For a
it.
minute. It's gonna get cold eventually. You're gonna have to get out of that bath, and
all
you're
you
gonna have to suffer.
17-year-olds out there, heed our
Yeah,
words.
right. I mean,
If
they're
it
saying
feels
now that your brain doesn't mature until you're 25 anyway. I mean, you don't actually have any thoughts. If you look at the
that's right.
history of war casualties, none of those people are really adults. I mean, they're all children,
Right.
right? That's the hardest part about it.
Yeah, I'm hoping for maturity at 45 at this point because a lot of my demographic are you know 12-year-old boys. They love
Really?
the well, I mean, not so much with
Well, no,
like
that's
fairy
true, isn't
books
it?
and
Because you're
stuff,
right.
but
I
you
would
got
have,
all
I
the
would have written,
weird facts and the ghost stories, and
yeah,
those are
I would have
like
read some stuff as a kid. I would have picked it up. I
oh,
remember reading alien books and ghost books, and they were
me
short
too, and I
stories.
probably would have been mildly like, there definitely would have been some things in there that were mildly inappropriate. But I remember reading Stephen King when I was 10 years old,
Oh, hell
totally
yeah.
inappropriate.
I was
But
younger than
yeah,
that. I was in
exactly.
second grade. I was
Oh,
reading a collection of his short stories in like second grade. Oh my
nice.
God. I mean, that's my kids are gonna have it worse, won't they? I mean,
Mm.
talking about reading inappropriate things, or I mean,
No,
this
you know what's gonna
subject matter
happen?
for
They're
Mark
not
Twain
gonna.
too, because the guy wrote inappropriate things too. Wasn't he considered more or less
He wrote a lot of
kind of
inappropriate things. There's a lot
right?
of racism. There's a
Yeah,
lot of really annoying dialects in his writing, and I'm by no means a Twain expert.
yeah,
But and that's part of the reason, because I never was really able to abide a lot of what he was writing about. I didn't relate to it. I didn't like it. I acknowledge that as a writer, and a political satirist, and there was a lot of humor there. A lot of it was tongue in cheek. Some of that's lost in the 100-year gap when you're reading it. Some of that's
yeah.
lost. It just is like,
Some of it,
actually, dude, you're just
unless
using
you're
the
a
N word,
kid
and that's not
and you
cool.
unless you're a kid and you pick up Mark, was it Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer? If you read those books when you're supposed to read them, you love Mark Twain for the rest of your life just for that. You know what I mean?
Right.
That was me. I read those
Right.
books when I was a
Yeah.
kid. I loved
Yeah.
those stories, loved those characters, and that's who Mark Twain is to me. There's also this claymation thing that came out in the 80s that had him as a character in it. And the thing basically takes place on some kind of zeppelin that goes through space.
Oh.
And the ending actually has, oh, it's so brilliant. I loved it so much. And I only saw like bits and pieces of it, because fuck the 80s and the fact that you didn't have a DVR to record things or
Just had
so
your internal DVR.
I have never seen this whole thing all the way through, just pieces and parts of it. But the end of it is him going on to the comments. Absolutely
Oh.
beautiful, beautiful.
Oh.
Just the last
Now,
part of that movie that I've seen hundreds of times is just the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life.
now I
But
loved the celebrated jumping frog. And
okay, yeah, I've
I
known
grew
that too,
and,
right? I
and
mean,
Calaveras
Mark Twain
County is a couple counties down from
in California.
where I grew up. So it's like, oh, the celebrated jumping
Wait,
frog, Calaveras
is that
County.
Nevada? Did
In
he
Nevada,
write that in Nevada?
Calaveras County is like in the southern foothills of California,
Oh,
kind
okay.
of close to, I don't know if it's the same county as Yosemite, but very close to Yosemite.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay, but he was
So,
writing that from Nevada, Carson City, I think.
but I think he actually attended this, they do this jumping frog thing there. And I
That's
think
so
he
awesome.
attended it. I'm not sure where he actually wrote it, but he had been there, and it's just over the hill to Carson City anyway. So it was, where it was set, he had actually been there. And you can, when they still do it every year, they do the
Do they
jumping
really?
frog contest.
Do
Yeah,
they
they
check the
totally,
frogs for stones?
you know, I haven't ever gone, so I haven't heard
The,
the
the
ins and
ritual
outs of,
stone
yeah,
checking. They
yeah.
they
But
turn the frogs upside
my
down and
sister
shake
went
them.
a couple years ago, and she
Oh
said,
yeah.
yeah, they do all kinds of weird things to the frogs, and she said it was, they were big
That's so
frogs,
fascinating.
and she said it was like kind of anticlimactic because it's just, there's basically just frogs jumping.
Yeah,
But
right.
that's not the point of the book, right? Or the story. The point of the story is that, everybody kind of gets behind this this frog, or this guy with this frog, and the fervor of the town based on and how much stock they put in this one thing. I think it's kind of something about gambling too, you know, kind of him talking about that fever that people were so adamant and experiencing, especially in the, you know, in California during that
Yeah.
time, or throughout the West. There was this kind of taking a chance. You put everything on the line. You put everything on the frog on the hopes that, you know, this gold mine would pay out.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So that, I mean, obviously you have that. There's other things too that are attributed to Mark Twain, but honestly, you have the frog and you have Tom Sawyer and you have Huckleberry Finn, and what else? I mean,
Yeah.
that's it, right? There's
Well, the
not really.
Connecticut Yankee and King
Okay.
Arthur's
Oh
Court.
my God, that's so good too. I read
That's a
that as well.
pretty. I mean, he, of course, we know he wrote, you know, hundreds of other short
Hundreds.
stories and several dozen novels. But the
But
ones
what
that
is he
really
famous?
we
Yeah,
are
he's
the
famous.
legacy.
He's famous for what he's famous for in terms
Yeah,
of like those stories.
and the
When he popped
Mississippi
off,
River kind of
then
setting, and
he's
yeah,
famous for being Mark Twain. Samuel
he's famous for being
Clemens,
Mark
the
Twain.
guy, is famous for being Mark Twain, right? I mean, he's been
Right. That's
all
his
over the
pen name.
place.
Yeah. Yeah, and did many things. And so I actually went back and I reread this
How long
Jap
is
Her
it?
It's long.
I
It's long.
read
Um,
it too.
did you?
No, how do you
Oh,
spell it so I can look it up on Wikipedia?
okay. It's it's JAP, Jap. It's short for Jasper, and then
Okay.
Herron, Herron, and that's the main character's name. And so, just to back up, in case, you know, whoever's listening to this is not familiar with the story, I'll give the
Okay.
nutshell story of Jap Herron. Um, in, I believe, 1916, a novel was published by a woman named Emily Grant Hutchings, and it was actually published by a publisher who published mainstream fiction, but also sort of dabbled in the psychic arts and the occult. And this, of course, was very popular at the time. You had a lot of people, especially women, who were making a name for themselves either by channeling or by being mediums. They would channel other entities and write volumes of poetry, including one woman whose name was Pearl Coran. And Pearl Coran channeled some poems and short stories by someone that she claimed was named Patience Worth. And actually, Patience Worth became very, very popular in the United States. This is all around the same time, 1910, 1912, 1914. She published several works and gained quite a bit of notoriety, and was even considered, like, you know, was considered one of the best poets in the country at the time. Patience Worth, the entity that spoke through Pearl Coran. Now, Pearl Coran was friends with a woman named Emily Grant Hutchings. And Emily Grant Hutchings, these were both Missouri, St. Louis
Wait, just to
housewives.
make one thing clear, Patience Worth was a ghost, right, or a spirit or
Yeah,
something. She
a
wasn't a real
spirit.
person.
Yes,
A
yes,
spirit,
she was
yeah.
an
Okay.
entity.
Well, I
Yes,
mean, I
exactly.
don't know how you want to define real
Ghost,
person, but
ghost.
she
We'll
was a
say
ghost or a
ghost.
spirit.
Yeah, but when you say ghost writing, people, there's a
Yeah,
difference.
it's not a person writing in somebody else's name. It's a ghost writing through somebody else.
Basically, yeah, like automatic writing, like channeling. Now,
Now, this
so
goes
these,
beyond automatic writing, though. I mean, automatic writing is like doesn't make sense, does it? When you look at automatic writing, it's not like it's not
well,
prose or even a letter. It's like, okay, what
actually
mystery is this?
I have actually done experiments before with automatic writing. And to me, it's a fine line between tapping into your divine muse and tapping into an entity. I think we have a lot of different names for it, but I have had times where I have deliberately tried to not, I don't use my mind, but basically just I've tried to just write whatever comes out, whether it's sensical or
Oh, I see.
nonsensical, and see what comes out of that sort of stream of consciousness. And sometimes I find real gems of something started in there. There's never been anything like from start to finish, but I have had a few experiences where, you know, I've just written something down and I go back and I look at it later. I have zero memory of writing it. I have zero memory of, and I think, well, that was, wow, I like that. Like, I think, who wrote that? That's not just short-term memory damage. I think that it means that I went to a different place while I was writing it,
It's very
and
interesting.
that's part of the creative process. I don't think that happens with everyone, but I don't think it's uncommon for writers to kind of, you know, check out at a certain point and let something else take over. So to me, there's this
I
fine
never have
line
that,
between, you
honestly. I
don't,
never
are you
check
just like
out.
struggling the whole time?
No, I seriously, I mean, I go through like little batches. I go through like maybe 300 words or something, and then I always go back and edit it, and I pull things out to try to make it longer and more descriptive. And I never write like a whole thing and then go back and go, okay, now what do I have? I'm constantly messing with it and futzing with it as I'm going through it. But also as
Yes.
my career is progressing, right? I've got this giant pile of shit that I'm trying to wade through. That's called my, my, what do they call it? Um, uh, Footlocker stories or whatever, and trying to make
Oh,
them
right.
better.
Right.
Right? I mean, I have a constant backlog of stuff that I'm working on, so I never have to worry about writer's block anymore. That's what it feels like anyway. I wonder
Yeah.
if that's more beneficial when you're finished. You're like that person that does a project and then you move on to the next project and starting the next project's always got to be arduous from zero.
Yeah, I don't know. I never really, I never, it's funny, so I never think there's anything of value in my previous journals.
Oh, really
And
interesting.
yet I've saved them all. And every once in a while I'll go back, and I'll think,
Right?
sometimes I remember what I was writing, and other times I think, oh, this is good. Now I have things kind of in the more recent years that I have kept on purpose because they're starts of things and notes for things that I'm currently working on. But I
Yeah.
mean, I have pretty much all my journals since I was a teenager.
I mean, I've sold stuff that were written years ago that were sentences, just start adding on to it. And next thing you
Yeah,
know, years later, you've got a 5,000 word story that's maybe worth something to somebody. I like it. And
yeah.
I mean, maybe I am writing automatically, automatic writing, just putting stuff down and then seeing if there's anything there immediately, and then shaping it and doing more automatic writing after that. I mean, little tiny bursts and bits and pieces work for me.
I love hearing about how other writers
Me too.
write and what their process is. It's very interesting to me, and I wish that there was more information about. And maybe there is. Again, I'm not a Twain scholar about how Twain wrote. Now I know some like Jack London. He wrote 1,000 words a day, every day. That
Yeah.
was, and you can visit his house at the Beauty Ranch. And I went on a tour there. This is in Glen Ellen, California, and they say, well, you think of it, he thought of it as a business. He
Yeah.
had this, and that was part of his method. He treated it like a job. He went in and he sat down and he wrote 1,000 words. He didn't necessarily write 1,000 words that he kept,
Yeah.
or 1,000 words that were perfect, but that was kind of what he did. Of course, at that point in his life and his career, he had already published many novels and was, living off the fat of them, and had this beautiful ranch that he ran.
He
So he
probably always
really,
wrote like that, though. I mean, that's a work ethic
he
that you
he
you have to
must have had a
develop.
work. Yes, he
Yeah,
had
you
a.
don't just become popular for one novel and go, okay, now I'm going to change my whole lifestyle. You're like,
Well, can
you're
you imagine getting like a 3-book contract, and then like the
not having a
first one
clue.
does amazing,
Yeah.
and then you're just like,
Yeah.
now you have all that pressure. Okay, now the second one has to be just as
How
amazing,
horrible.
and it's
Yeah.
due by a certain date. And it's like, that sounds
Novels
like,
are
yeah,
hard too. I mean, you sit down
yeah.
and try to write a 50, 60, 70, 80,000 word story. It's like it
It's
can
very
feel like you're
difficult.
murdering yourself from the inside out.
It can, and I think like sometimes I feel like I take the easy way out when I do a nonfiction work, because I always have fiction going on the side.
Yeah.
But nonfiction, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that's kind of what really can kind of, I don't know. It's just like I have structure that I can fill in the blanks. I mean, the
Well,
structure
I
I
definitely
created.
appreciate what you're doing because you're curating collections of work. I mean, obviously, you're doing it for another reason, though, too. I mean, I didn't even know that you wrote a lot of fiction, that much fiction.
Yeah, well, that's that's because it usually gets sidelined by the something that the publisher will actually
I mean, you
buy.
want to pay your rent, right? I mean, ultimately, it gets sidelined
Right.
by the stuff that you know that you could sell. I mean, you form relationships like that, it's hard to navigate away from them. I talked to a guy yesterday. I mean, yeah, we're kind of navigating away from Mark Twain, but I talked to a guy yesterday who found himself writing reference books on,
Oh,
various science fiction worlds or whatever from like the 1900s. Like he compiles these gigantic these materials that fans of that stuff love, but his fiction squanders. I mean, nobody cares that he writes, whatever he writes. They only care about the reference. He's popular over in this genre. Nobody cares about his fiction. So,
That's why you use a pen name.
That's why, right? I mean, you can't expect there to be a crossover if you write romance and
Not until you get to a certain
Western.
point. I mean, even Stephen King used a pen name,
Or Anne
right?
Rice,
Like,
yeah, right.
yeah.
That's an example that works. So she wrote that hardcore Harlequin, S&M, whatever the hell it's called. I mean, basically Lolita. Did
Oh,
you read her?
you mean
The Vampire Lady,
Interview
Anne
with the
Rice?
Vampire? Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah,
No,
yeah,
she
yeah.
wrote
So she
a
had the
series
other.
of
Mhm.
porn, basically. I mean, it was
Yes,
straight porn.
yes. Sort of like erotic, slightly
Yeah,
paranormal romance. Yeah, yeah. And she wrote it and then she
under another
later
name, yeah.
renounced her sinful ways, and
Yeah,
now she's back to sinning again,
now she's got
apparently,
this
or
thing
she's good
again,
with
yeah.
it. Yeah, it's like,
She's
come
not her.
on, we first.
She wrote. I wish I was into her writing during that period because she did write some interesting sounding books
Yes,
on
I had
Jesus and
a lot of my peers were really into her and really liked her writing. I read the first book, Interview with the Vampire,
yeah,
and I just
didn't
uh,
like that stuff.
I don't want to be too disparaging of it because I get why people enjoyed it. It was
Uh-huh.
very juicy in a lot of ways,
I
but
love
it
a lot
just
of ways.
wasn't really wasn't quite my cup of tea. I
I
was,
loved it honestly. When I was a kid, I was ninth grade when I discovered her Interview
yeah,
with
I
the
think I was
Vampire,
probably, ninth,
like
ninth
91 or something like that. But I loved it. I've read every single one of her books up until like I think. I mean, it got crazy, right? The idea of the soul was definitely being talked about in her work and how it flowed from one
Oh,
body to the
yes.
other. And
And she really kind of brought, vampirism back
yeah,
to mainstream culture in a way that we really needed. And from that, we evolved into being more accepting of, ghosts and witches and all that kind of good stuff,
yeah,
which we
man,
kind
her
of go
Witch
through.
series is fantastic too. She's a fantastic author. I really wish I was into her work. And I don't know if it's the nature of fiction in general. It's written for a younger audience, maybe, but I just cannot get into her stuff anymore.
Yeah.
Might be me. I'm having a hard time getting into anything lately.
I think if we like today, we might think of that more as like YA, not teen novels, but
Right?
YA, someone kind of more in their like 20s, and there's usually a lot of sex.
I mean,
It's
nowadays,
like,
that would
quite
be like the
frankly,
poster
you
girl.
get older and you're just like, yeah, there's your own imagination is far more rich than most things in the
It's true. But
the written
then
word.
MCU is crazy popular right now too, those Marvel superhero movies.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, people love to have the escapism, but they hate Star Wars. I don't know. People are fickle, aren't they? Fickle.
Jerks. They're all a bunch of jerks.
This book came out in 1917, right?
Yes, right. So just getting back to that. So just basically to paint the background is that the Mark Twain died, or Samuel Clemens died in 1910.
10. Yep.
It was no surprise. I mean, it's no surprise to anyone who's heard of Twain. We already talked about his like penchant for the comet. He was interested in innovation. He was interested in electricity. He was interested in psychic phenomenon. He attended seances, but not as a spiritualist believer necessarily, but in a way that he was hungry for knowledge.
Yeah.
He was a
It's
printer, he
interesting.
was a publisher, so he always wanted to learn new things. He had that entrepreneurial spirit. And so anyway, this woman, her name was Emily Grant Hutchings. She lives in St. Louis. She's in her, I think, 20s or early 30s. She's a housewife. And she's friends with Pearl Coran, who's also a housewife, who's a bit older. And Pearl Coran's the one who channeled this Patience Worth. They start attending seances together and using the Ouija board together. Pearl goes on to have, as I had mentioned, like quite a bit of success with the works of Patience Worth, and is
So
still
I'm sorry,
talked about
one
today.
quick second. What were the works of Patience Worth? I know she was a poet. She was writing from the netherworld or
Um,
whatever, but
yeah, so
she
she
was
wrote
collecting that work and printing it and publishing it
yes, it was published.
already.
I think
Okay.
the first one was a collection of poetry, but there were several novels as well. And they were about all different kinds of things. I mean, it was essentially that she was, the spirit of this woman from, I think, a couple decades prior, who was kind of uh, writing through Pearl.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the basic gist of her. And then, so this friend of hers, Emily, now I like to think that Emily, she's the one who sort of introduced Pearl to the psychic arts. And I think that Emily was and I say that she was a housewife, not to disparage, housewives of today, but housewives in 1890, 1900, and the teens, you didn't, if you were a housewife and you were a housewife of a fairly successful but not necessarily wealthy man, you were Mrs. Hutchings. You were never known as who you were as an individual, and your place in society was very predetermined. And you'll find that throughout the and this is kind of like the whole crux of my most recent book, is that like there were all of these women, especially, who found a way to break free from the confines of late Victorian, early Edwardian, pre-World War I society via the psychic arts. They could travel, they could write, they could do all of these things, and they would do it under the guise of it being kind of beyond their control. So anyway, so Emily writes this. So the story
convenient,
is
right? It's beyond my control, so it's not working today. I'm sorry.
Right, and also that more that who would stand in the way of the divine, right? Like no husband's going to stand in the way of the divine. Plus, you could make a bunch of money, so you didn't have to say you. Women of that era did not have, weren't given much credit. They were expected to do a lot of work, and they were expected to support their husband's success, period. So you didn't really have the like, oh, her opinion might be actually valid. Not that there weren't women who were successful writers and were doing things, but there were a lot of women who were kind of confined to, whatever my husband says is fine. Not really even allowed to make their own decisions. They were married into the family. So,
well, what's really fascinating? Recently, I read an article about Saudi Arabian women. They were given an option in a poll: would you rather things stay the same or be different? And the majority of Saudi Arabian women said they want things to remain the same. They don't want to rock the boat. I mean, they're treated really, really well, right? Like precious things women are in general when the family is put together correctly. So, I mean, they're happy the way things are. They don't want to do more than what they're already doing. So I wonder if Victorian age,
right, or they're afraid to answer honestly because their husbands are reading what they're writing.
The other option, right? I mean, that could be it. I mean, we don't know for sure.
No, we don't. But there is a fine line between that. Of course, there's the idea
but it does
that
feel like society always goes back to that, unfortunately.
Well, hopefully that's changing on a more permanent. They're definitely cycles.
It's really shocking, isn't it? There are places around the world that do not believe it, and they're called Oklahoma or freaking Texas. I mean, they're right around the corner, and they speak the same language as we do, and they want like a Sharia law where they don't give women the rights. I mean, this has not changed. I'm just speaking.
It's just disguised in a different way. It's disguised in a different way. Now it's whether or not you have the right to make a decision about your own body. Now that's in jeopardy, versus whether or not you have the decision to, accept an invitation to a dinner party. I mean, but anyway, so here's that just trying to kind of give you the idea of the atmosphere in which this novel was born.
Yeah.
So you have this woman, and the story is, and the best part, if you get a chance to read Jap Herron, the best part of it is the introduction. But if you want the cliff notes and you want a better explanation, buy my book and read my book, because it's right there in the middle, kind of the middle section.
Which one of your books is it?
It's the Varla Ventura's Paranormal Parlor, and the chapter is actually called, and remind me if you got that one, because
I did. I'm looking at it right now.
Okay, yeah. Okay. I know they sent you a bunch of books. It is chapter 3, Ouija. Would you look at that?
Oh, did I get that one? I got 3 books. I don't think I got that one.
Oh, really?
Among the Mermaids. And here it is. I can't read.
So anyway, here's the environment in which these women were kind of writing or coming into their own. And she writes this novel and she finds a publisher for it. The best part about the novel, in my opinion, is the provenance, the story, the introduction that she provides. And the story is that she walks into this gal walks into a seance, and basically she does. She walks into a seance, and the medium says to her, um, sit down. We've been waiting for you, or something like that.
Cool.
And basically, the story is that, the ghost of Samuel Clemens had been communicating a couple times with this medium, and said that he had a story that he wanted to tell, but he wanted to tell it. He would only tell it to the right person. And when Emily walks into the seance, he identifies her as the right person. And so they painstakingly translate via a series of sessions. Her husband ends up being the scribe for a lot of it, and Emily overseeing and writing it down. They channel this novel, and it is a novel. It's at least 40,000 words. I don't remember exactly how long it is, but it's very
This says
long.
245 pages, so about 50,000 maybe.
Yeah, it's quite long. And I went back and reread it because it had been some time since I had actually read the novel. I, memorized the backstory behind it. And,
Yeah, it's so cool.
I have lots and lots of speculation about, was it real? Wasn't it real? Where was she coming from? There's a great deal of, there are some clues here and there about a relationship that she may have had with Twain via letters. There's something to suggest she was a bit of a fangirl, but then you're looking at that, and you're looking at it.
Famous. I mean, he's outrageously famous.
He's outrageously famous, and
worldwide. I mean, in Europe as well. I mean, worldwide, in what we call culture here, Western Europe and America.
I think around the world, really, though.
Oh, really? Okay.
I mean, some of the Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, and things like that. But I think that so I read this letter. When I was researching this originally, I just read it in an online archive, and I can't even remember where it was off the top of my head. It was like UC Berkeley. And the letter was essentially saying that it was like an essay. It had excerpts from letters, and it showed a letter from Emily and a letter from Mark Twain in response, or from Samuel Clemens in response. But the person who wrote the essay was saying, it seemed that she may have felt jilted by him, or she was dismissed by him. And so she turned around and came up with this way to get back at him. And that never sat right with me for a couple of reasons.
7 years is the first thing that came to my mind. It's a lot of time.
and for one thing, it's frustrating to me that somebody writing to that. It's frustrating to me that she would be considered jilted and vengeful when she was seeking advice from somebody, and that it immediately becomes that it's this woman who's just trying to get attention, and she's just trying to sensationalize, and she's just a fangirl, and she's dismissed. So whether this actually is a truly channeled work, or it was actually the ghost of Twain, that is still, in my mind, very much up for debate.
Well, let's do this. Let's discuss the why it's real. What would you say makes it credible? Anything? What makes it what makes it
So here's the problem. If you read it, I think you figure out pretty quickly it's not Twain.
Well, that's a big problem.
That is to me, with the outside perspective, that to me, not being a Twain scholar, not being a hugely familiar with his works, there's something in the first paragraph that is just right away you're like, would Twain really ever start? Let me see if I can pull it up, because I was looking at it this morning on Gutenberg, the novel in its entirety. The very first paragraph, there's the opening line. I went through and I actually went onto Gutenberg and read the opening line to a bunch of different Twain stories just to see, because no good novelist has ever gone down in history that doesn't know how to do a damn good opening paragraph, right?
He's a great novelist, but his opening lines suck. You never hear that. I mean, Stephen King can open a novel. Right. The dude can't close a novel to save his life, but he can open novels.
Okay, so let's see. I'm just scrolling there. Anyway, so the opening line was very rough, and I'm about to find it here. The gist of the story So there are things in the story that make sense that have to do with Twain. The gist of the story is that there's a young boy. His name is Jasper Herron, known as Jap Herron, and he's kind of raised in this funky environment. His father dies, his mother's poor, and he's sort of taken in by a newspaper man. And he's taken in by someone, and then he sort of worms his way into apprenticing with this newspaper man, and eventually becomes sort of like the main newspaper man in the town. And it's just sort of about this little town in an undescribed location in, the Midwest,
Well,
basically.
that's odd too, isn't it? Because he was very specific about where people are from. He liked
Right. So
destinations. He liked to go places.
that's a good point. Yeah, this is just called Bloomtown or something like that. Um, this is the opening line. As every well-bred story has a hero, and as there seems better material in Jap than any other party to this story, we will dignify him. Mary Herron feebly asserted her rights in the children by naming them respectively. And then he goes on to talk about the family. I don't know. There's just something about that just seems like, really? I don't know. This doesn't
I
seem
mean, you
very
might be
convincing to
looking
me.
at a failed novel too, that he never actually got around to reworking. He probably had hundreds of them lying around potentially, right? I mean, you
Sure.
do, I do, everybody does.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
If
a
you
layman
die,
walks
what's in
in,
your
a
drawer?
fan walks into our house and looks at what we have available. They're like, damn, how come none of this stuff's published? Give me it all.
All right. Well, and that's a dream, right?
Right, exactly.
Oh, please feed us your scraps,
Please,
sir.
Ms.
Throw
Ms.
your
Ventura,
scraps
give
at
me
me.
all of your scraps, all of your sentences and words that you love.
Which is what would happen if somebody walked into Stephen King's office,
Right?
right? They'd
They
be
would.
like,
They would pick up
oh, "What's
everything.
in that drawer? No, let me
What's
touch
this?
that. Let me have that.
Let me read
Let me
this as
sell it on
something real.
eBay."
Yeah, exactly. And he's got trash. Not trash, but he's got stuff lying around that's
He's
still
got,
being
of
worked on.
course, of
Yeah.
course. And I think
So
we
this is
talked before about Bram Stoker and his the scraps that he thought weren't deemed fit for publication that his widow found in a drawer of his desk and then sent them to the publisher. And it's this collection of short stories, and they're
yeah.
so fucking good. I mean, it's just like, really, dude.
It's really interesting because if you look at a lot of careers of authors, they're hungry in the very beginning. They're starving for attention. They're starving to get their stuff out there. They'll do anything. They'll morph themselves. They'll learn stuff. They'll ask advice. They'll do whatever it takes to get published to make a living. And then once they start getting published and making a living, they get a little cocky, like they know what they're doing. And when you get to the point where Twain was at the end of his life, he could do whatever the F he wanted, right? I
Yeah,
mean, he could
yeah,
make
right.
decisions. He could put verbs in past tense and a present tense sentence, and people, that's genius. Who would
So
have thought that? And
it,
he's making money off of it. So who knows? Maybe this novel is in the works. Maybe it was complete trash.
well, so there's a lot of reference both in the introduction by her and in the novel itself to a lot of like it's like it's written for an editor.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of grammatical lamentations. In the introduction, he talks about how he's tired of having to spell out things, and can she please put an apostrophe on the board so that he can do contractions, because he's running at the board trying to push this planchet around,
Yeah.
and it's difficult.
So he was
Um,
spelling it by letter,
he's
with that
spelling it
little
letter by
tiny
letter. So then
planchette. Is that
there's
what you called it? Is that thing? Is that
the
little
planchette. Yeah, that's what it's
planchette?
called. So here's a lovely a part that I love. I think I'm just going to read it out of the book, where they turn this Ouija board into a typewriter, a psychic typewriter, and it's just friggin' genius. Just the whole idea of that. But where's one of these great quotes for? Okay,
Oh
so
my
this I love
God, I
this.
do love the idea of a psychic typewriter, and I really want to have come back for other stuff as well.
So she writes this in the this is in the introduction. This is an excerpt from the introduction. The work of transmitting that first story was attended with the greatest difficulty. No less than 3 distinct styles of diction, accompanied by correspondingly distinct motion in the planchette under our fingers, were thrust into the record. At first, we were at a loss to understand these intrusions. That they were intrusions, there could be no doubt. In each case, there was a sharp deviation from the plot of the story as it had been given to us in the synopsis. After one of these experiences, which resulted in the introduction of a paragraph that was rather clever but not at all pertinent, Mark regained control. She refers to him as Mark, which I love. She just starts calling him Mark like halfway into the thing. Mark regained control with the impatiently traced words, "Every scribe here wants a pencil on earth." And so here's this beautiful idea of this kind of galley of ghosts waiting for their story to be told. And he's sort of the lucky one that got the jackpot, because not only did he find a medium that he could talk through, but he found a writer that he felt an affinity to who could tell his lost story.
Has anybody written the story of the story being told?
Me.
This begs to be a novel, though, doesn't it? Because this character, Emily Grant Hutchings, I mean, what the hell, dude?
This could
right?
be. This would be a wonderful novel. You've got them writing back and forth, and the story of the story, and you have
mystery,
correspondence with like
break it apart. Does Jack? I mean, there's a copyright issue with this thing too, or is it now?
No. So here's the story with it. So it got published. And the word got out, publicity got out, and the Samuel Clemens' daughter and his publisher sued the publisher, Emily's publisher. I forget the name of the publisher off the top of my head. And he had to stop production, and basically it was torn from the stands. However, a few editions did get out there, because if you look on Gutenberg, you will see it's actually a facsimile. It's a photocopied version of the original book as it was published, and that's where we have the manuscript of it that we have today. So it was published, didn't see much light of day, and then was torn from the stands, and she was highly ridiculed after, and basically it put an end to her writing career, more or less. So
did she try? It's basically the equivalent to trying to trademark the word cocky, is what you're saying?
Well, it's a little bit like the whole James Frey thing, right? Where like if you went
that was such a good book. Oh my God, I love that so much.
And if all you ever did was just read the book, you would have been fine. But then he starts talking about how he created the book, and and then he goes on Oprah and he lies, and everybody's just like, you.
Oh man, he was such a good writer. I think he had so much potential.
Your introvert status, buddy, or put creative nonfiction on there. Come on. We know the rules.
And is that an issue still? Is he done, James Frey, or did he end up doing more stuff? Just curious,
I don't know.
Because that was
That's a good question. I have no idea. You should get him on your show. He's probably would be happy to get the publicity.
I'd love to talk to him. I thought that was a
wonderful book. He's a wonderful writer. So, I mean, if I were him, I would have just changed my pen name and,
That's probably what happened. He lives in Cleveland.
But unfortunately, with publishing,
right? You don't live in Cleveland and write novels, right?
Well, I think, one thing with him is that, it's very true that it's hard to get published on just being a good writer.
Yeah.
That's the hardest thing to do. And it's possible. And it's one of the last, great bastions of a career that you just need raw talent and somebody to notice it. But there's a certain degree of marketing. And once you've had success, use that success. So let's say I'm writing a novel and I write it under an entirely different pen name. I'm going to put in my cover letter that I have, these books and this is how many copies have sold and they're successful, because I'm not going to just, pretend like that doesn't exist, right? It's all the merit of my writing, but it's not really relevant to the actual, story I might be submitting or whatever. Yeah. So anyway, I just think that's total sidebar, but I think he could change his pen name and he would just have to start all over again on the merit of the quality of his writing and not use the name James Frey. And maybe he is.
But you know what the unfortunate thing is about the unfortunate thing about James Frey is that James Frey is willing to fuck himself really hardcore, because it turns out in 2009 he hired a bunch of MFA graduates to write like vampire fiction and gave them all the shittiest contracts in the entire world that went public.
Oh, really?
It's been crap since then. I mean, basically, he might be right. He might change his name or buried himself. I mean, he was a dick, right? And he lied.
But okay, but so the thing is, though, is that what he did is he did what you're never safe in conversation with a writer. And if you don't know that, you don't know a writer, or they haven't admitted it to you, because anything you say can and will be used in a novel at some point, right?
Yeah.
Like our imaginations, that's just like we're talking, it's like it gets sparked. And so if somebody tells me, that um they tell me the story of being in a car accident when they were 10 years old, and and they're giving me like the details of what they remember. If I have a character and what I should do is put them in a car accident, there's going to be a little piece of that. Whatever the person told me, it sparked my imagination. This is why we tell stories. This
Yeah.
is why we listen to stories. This is why we read stories. I'm not saying I'm taking somebody's firsthand account, but there's always that like risk that whenever you tell a writer something deeply personal, the cogs are turning in their head.
But
His
isn't the thing
mistake
though?
is that his
Yeah.
mistake is that he didn't say that it was fiction. If
Yeah.
it was fiction, then you have that ability to embellish without having to be held accountable for it,
The
right?
worst, I
Like
mean, the
people
second
are
part
more like,
about that
"Oh, did
is
you
he
really
never
do
wrote
that?"
anything, did he? Again, I mean, if he had written another badass book or three or four or five and shown that, fine, it was a
Yeah.
little lie, it
Right, it
didn't
was
happen.
really his first big deal, and it was such a big deal, but the thing is then you look at it and you think, but part of the reason it was a big deal is because he said it actually happened. So
Well,
if
yeah,
he
I
had done
mean,
it as fiction, it might have fallen
Cinderella,
to the
right?
wayside,
That's how he
along with
sold
other
himself.
things.
So, I
Right.
mean, that's actually it's a
And
brilliant segue
and it
because I
was
mean, he did market himself as a Cinderella, and these people, I mean, we're talking about a different age though. In the early part of the 20th century, in 1910, did these women say, you know what, I have written a novel and I want to sell it, but I know they're never going to buy it from me, so I need to lie and say that Mark Twain wrote it. When we've both talked about, Mary Shelley writing under, was it her husband, or she wrote under a pseudonym as well, right? I mean, a masculine sounding pseudonym for a little while. So why lie and say Mark Twain? That's the part that bothers me,
right, and then that could actually be an argument for credibility then, like,
right? Why say that?
why would you bother saying,
Why
because
him specifically?
she didn't do what her friend did, which was that I'm channeling a spirit, and this is what the spirit is telling me, and that was popular because we were obsessed at that time. That was the height of the spiritualist movement, which was the belief that not just that there was life after death, but that the dead could communicate with us.
Yeah,
During that time of in history, especially in the United States, we had the melding of all of these different cultural ideas, right? People were coming from all these different countries. They had different beliefs. You had
yeah,
Catholicism, Christianity. You had people who, kept slaves, people who
yeah,
were abolitionists, and they were all
yeah,
there was this constant kind of meeting of the minds. And a lot of people who were involved in the spiritualist movement actually were also very, they were suffragists and abolitionists as well, because people involved in the spiritualist movement tended to be middle class, white America, usually first or second generation. And
Well, when you
they
say abolitionist, though, you're backing it up like 50 years, right? I mean, you're
Right,
saying
right. Well, so
1850, 18
the
whatever.
spiritualist movement started in about 1840 and it went to about 1930.
Okay,
This sort of obsession with the
occult.
afterlife and the
When was
excuse me,
Aleister
parlor game.
Crowley? He was beginning part of the 20th century too, wasn't he? He was the
Hmm.
tail end of that stuff.
Hmm. I believe he channeled the Book of the Law, which was channeled in a
Oh, he
um,
was channeling stuff too?
he channeled the Book of the Law, which is kind of
That's
the
interesting.
ultimate like foundation work for anyone studying him. He was in a one of the great pyramids. I don't remember which one. He was in one of the great pyramids in Egypt, and he dropped into a trance, and he wrote the Book of the Law. And there are actually the same publisher that I have. They publish a version of the Book of the Law. I believe I have a copy, that is his first handwritten version, and it's
Well,
beautiful.
there's chapter two
Like a
of this
poem.
discussion right there. I want to do an Aleister Crowley podcast. Oh my God, that'd be so cool. I don't know anything about him, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I know about him as I know some stuff about him actually. I probably know maybe more than the average person, but certainly not much, not as much as a diehard follower. But
But I mean, honestly, I mean, so this is a thing. I mean, people are doing this. Aleister Crowley's doing this. This
right.
woman over here is doing this, and they're all English, right? I mean, they're This woman is
Usually it
English
was
too?
happening most in the UK and the United States. She was from the United States. She was American. It was
Yeah,
most popular in the UK and the Americas and or in the United States. And some parts of Europe, there were some like German parlor things and such,
gotcha.
but mostly UK and the US. This particular movement, the spiritualist movement,
Man,
and
you have to write a novel though. That's the thing. And I don't
so
understand why give when Aleister Crowley wrote his book, he said, "Oh, the Egyptian pharaohs gave it to me." But they said Mark Twain. They didn't say Charles Dickens or Seneca or anybody like that. They said Mark Twain for some stupid reason. I guess it's just random, right? It could be anybody. They just chose
well,
him. And how the hell
it's
did they write
not
the
random
novel?
though, and that's more of the story. There's more to the story than probably we even know, but there is a connection between
Her and Mark Twain.
her and Mark Twain. There's a connection. So here's the other thing about the story itself. It tries a little too hard to bring up things that Mark Twain would have been interested in. So, for example, I was talking about sort of like the grammar. It was like written for an editor
Mhm.
because it's set in like a newspaper. You know, they work at a newspaper in this small town. There's this whole discussion about colons and semicolons, and basically the apprentice sands them off because he needs more spaces, needs to be able to put more spaces between words, and he doesn't think that the semicolon and the colon are important enough. So then the big newspaper man, the head guy, they have this whole discussion about the importance of punctuation. And so in her introduction, she kind of talks about punctuation a lot. So there's these things that, yes, he was a publisher, and I do think he was very, he wrote a lot of, you know, literary criticisms and things like that. It was almost just like, oh, let's put this other thing in here that we know that Mark Twain is really interested in. And there's a couple of things like that in the novel itself. It's so hard for me to be completely objective because I already know the backstory, and that's the other trick. The introduction doesn't allow you to be objective. It basically forces you to either it forces you to think about Mark Twain one way or the other. You're either reading it thinking there's no way, or you're reading it thinking there's a way. But nonetheless, you're not just handed the novel without the introduction,
Yeah.
without the provenance, right? You're just and then you read it. You have to read this introduction. It's the first part of the book, and there's, it's called The Coming of Jap Herron, and that's kind of like how it came to be. And that's the remarkable thing about it. Nobody else had, lots of people had done automatic writing, channeling. No one else had actually transcribed from a Ouija board. And so just in terms of like a literary feat or the idea of that I mean, maybe they didn't even do it, right? So
They
my
did do it though. They wrote a novel. You read it,
they
245 pages
right, they wrote a
from New
novel.
Bend in
Did they channel
1917.
it letter by letter from the Ouija board, or did
I
they
don't
just
know.
make that whole beginning up too?
But they wrote a novel. I mean,
But
what the
they wrote
story
a
is
novel, and
ultimately
they
is,
wrote a backstory to the novel and how the novel came to be, which is genius.
I mean, but all of it is. It's like an incredibly inventive story.
I know, it's so great. It's just like this whole kind of other level to something that otherwise probably would have gone completely unforgotten and has
Yeah.
not very many. I mean, it's not really, really widely known. And when I stumbled upon it, um, honestly, I was looking at Gutenberg to try and find some old writings on some paranormal stuff, and I was typing in words like paranormal, ghost. I typed in Ouija, and it just popped up. It said a novel written, um, a
It
novel
says a
written
novel written
entirely
from the vision board. Yep.
from the Ouija board, and
By the
it's just like, wait, sorry, what? I don't know, how am I in my 40s and I've never heard of this before? And I back up and I learned the backstory, and then I did more and more research. And there's honestly, I think that even if there was a novel, or there could even just be a longer kind of exposition of the story itself, because there's so many. It's like you could have one half of the book the argument for, and one half of the book the argument against whether or not this was actually channeled material,
If
or
you
if
look
it
at
was channeled
Wikipedia,
by Twain.
if you're on Wikipedia, they say specifically a novel written or authored by Mark Twain 7 years
Right.
after his death when you click on the link. But when you search Jap Herron on Google, the little sidebar, it says author
Emily
Mark
Grant
Twain.
Hutchings. Oh,
No, it says
it'll
Mark
list her as
Twain.
co-author too.
I will show you a picture. I'm going to email it
Yeah,
to you
no,
right
I
now.
believe you. I believe you. I mean, it's, but that's,
It's
that's
interesting,
just a
right? Because it's
general.
continuing. Like the lore of this work is not stopping. Like these people wrote this book and this is the gist of it. No, it's saying Mark Twain wrote this
Right,
7 years after he died.
right.
So Wikipedia is continuing the bullshit, or the bullshit never stopped. She took her to the Supreme Court, right? She took her to
Wikipedia.
Washington, D.C. It's wonderful. I love it so much. I hope that artificial intelligence takes over, because Wikipedia is proof that they'll do a better job than we ever could. Unlimited
Well,
free information right in front of me.
we are controlling Wikipedia. That's what I
Okay.
don't like about Wikipedia, is that the people can edit it. And so
Yeah,
because of that, you can find speculation,
doesn't
opinions.
matter. Did you know that Abraham Lincoln killed vampires? I mean, I didn't know that shit. They wrote a whole book about it, and I believe it. I believe it.
Right. So they'll say it's transcribed, but nonetheless, she got
Yeah.
oh, by the way, and if you see the name Lola V. Hayes, she's the psychic.
Oh, I was
She's
going to ask. Yeah, her name
yeah.
isn't really in the Wikipedia at all.
No. She's
So
well, then it
I
must
don't
not
think she
exist.
existed, Varla. She's not a real person if she's not in Wikipedia.
She's the psychic. She's the
Okay.
medium. So that
And
was the
she's
thing, is
English.
that when I
She's from London.
yeah, and she was like a traveling medium during the time who took up residence and was probably paid handsomely to continue uh, this experience. It was so that they both had their fingers on the planchette, but it was thought quite often then that if you
Wait,
weren't a medium, that you required a medium to make
the work
this
of Ouija board.
contact. Yeah.
So
So
this person obviously is findable. Was she in the preamble to the novel or no?
the psychic,
Yeah,
yes,
she
yep,
was. Okay.
yep. That's how I found her.
And she's
Yeah.
a real person that existed and not a contrivance.
I didn't do a lot of research into her backstory, but there was nothing to indicate that. I mean, if it was a very likely scenario, it was a very common scenario then to have. Maybe I did research her. I
So
can't
basically,
remember.
let me paint this picture. We have a ghost who
We've got a
reads
ghost
poems
who's
through the Ouija
pacing,
board.
waiting for. He's this
No, you have
ghost.
two ghosts though. You have one that's writing poetry. Who transcribed her poetry
She transcribed it directly.
to the author of Jap
She
Herron?
okay. Wait, no. The poetry, that's Patience Worth, that's
Yes.
Pearl Coran, and she went into trance and would do automatic writing
Oh, I see.
most of
Okay.
the time.
And just give it credit to
Also,
the
she also hung out, at psychic salons and used the Ouija board, and that may be where she first came in contact with the entity, but she didn't transcribe via the Ouija. That
okay.
was Emily Grant Hutchings, her psychic, Lola Hayes, and her
That's so
husband,
interesting.
who helped transcribe, and he's the one who kind of figured out ways to fashion the Ouija board into more of a typewriter like situation.
So fantastic. 1917. What was being written at that time? And you have a bunch of science fiction serials being written,
Hmm.
right? I mean, who writes this novel in 1917? I mean, not in 1917. Who writes this novel and completing it in 1917, or going to the Supreme Court in
I think
1917?
they started in 1915 or 1916. They started writing it, and it took them about a year to get it to complete publishing manuscript form.
It's
So
pretty good, right? I mean, they're working on manual typewriters, even if they're not trying to communicate from beyond. That's impossible. Write this in a year, right? I mean, it
right.
doesn't happen. You're writing one letter at a time
Well,
using a planchette to point
it's
at them and
pretty right, and she's saying they got multiple drafts too.
multiple drafts. I mean, I can't even talk to you for an hour and do like a short story. I don't think we can get like 5,000 words out of this 2-hour conversation.
Oh, we could.
Maybe.
Now,
We barely talked this whole time. I
I
don't
know. I
know.
feel like we could continue this conversation, but I do want to throw one more thing about, because we always like to do our teaser for next time. But if we want to talk about Aleister Crowley,
Yep.
um, So my knowledge and my appreciation of Aleister Crowley is less from the occult point of view and more from the writer and editor and sort of genius that he was in this world that he created. Not to disparage or disagree with the teachings that people still follow today, but he wrote a series of journals called the Equinox and would write. They were all, everything were magical publications, but he was a genius because he would write. He had unknown number of pen names. He would write scathing reviews of his own work and publish
I
them.
love
And
it.
so he had this wonderful sense of humor. So people think, oh, Aleister Crowley, is just very serious kind of situation. And he actually had this wonderful sense of humor. And there are a few people who write about him today who really get that. And that's how I learned about him. One is a man named Lon Milo Duquette. And Lon Milo Duquette, I worked with him on a couple of story collections, and he, in an editorial capacity, and he is the one who sort of enlightened me to the sort of playful side and this other side that people don't always acknowledge about Aleister Crowley. And, it's that whole kind of writing the thing within the thing. He also wrote several novels, and they're quite good. I mean, he really was a talented writer. So he
And he's
just has
not
a very
disappearing. He's hanging
he,
out.
he has an
He's,
interesting life, and he's known as this
yeah.
cult figure, but he really made a lot of he just did all of these funny little, it's like little Easter egg type things that he would hide in his works and references, and like I said, scathing reviews. And so
Cool.
I would read something in this. So when I read the Equinox, I read the entire 10 volumes of the Equinox, but I read it looking for him, trying to figure out who was real. Was this person, that did this review, is that just another pen name? And I would ask Law on occasion, like, is this actually him? Is this woman's name? Is this actually? And he just kind of shrugged. He's like, we don't know. Either he knew and he didn't tell me, or we don't know. So there's a great kind of, in terms of speculating about his role in fiction and things along those lines. He's a great candidate. I don't know if I'm your best bet for him, but
Oh,
I'll
we're
take a
just gonna geek out and
shot.
see what's up. I mean, in terms of he's a character, right? And he's kind of
Yes,
living in our culture a little bit as kind of like a magical person. He was a hedonist,
guru. Yeah,
wasn't he? I mean,
yeah, yeah.
he was totally all about feeling good all the time.
Yeah,
And
and he was a pagan, and he believed in a lot of things that upset Christianity. And he's mislabeled as a devil and as a Satan worshiper. And he was actually dubbed the wickedest man in the world for speaking what he felt was the truth. And that's how I came to love him, because I will love anyone who's dubbed it's like Salman Rushdie, right? It's like,
yeah,
oh, really? That's banned? Let me buy 7
let me
copies.
let me hand them
You
out to
know?
my friends.
Yeah, and hand them out to my friends. It's like, did you just say banned? Because I'm there.
I now sell this book professionally. Um, so, I mean, to sum up I mean, we didn't sum up anything, honestly. We can't
to
sum this up.
to sum
What,
up, in summary,
what a great concept this story is. I have to know though, what's your opinion one way or the other? Do you have a definite way to think about this? Is it Mark Twain or is it not? I think you've already told me, but is it Mark Twain or not Mark Twain?
I mean, I just waver back
Do you
and
want it to be
forth.
Mark Twain? Yeah.
I want it
You
to be
want it to
the
be him,
ghost of
don't
Mark
you? Yeah.
Twain. I don't think it's the ghost of Mark Twain, but I
You don't.
do think that they did it. I do think that I don't
Yeah.
think the whole process what didn't happen. I think they did channel it via the Ouija, and I think they did speak with someone that they thought was
Oh, I see.
Twain. Um, but I don't think that it was Twain, and I think there's too much of her in it. So either she's a heavy-handed editor.
But the thing that works against it is that the people were doing this at that time. They were channeling works of fiction. And then also what works against it is the biggest proponent of it was Aleister Crowley, and who's channeling his work now? Know what I mean?
Right.
Nobody's saying,
Well,
I've got Aleister Crowley's new novel, guys. I'm going to tweet about it all day long.
I think
Nobody
what
seems
really counted against her was that it seemed as if she were trying to just publish on his name.
exactly.
So that would so that makes it seem like she's just not standing on her own 2 feet and she's saying this is Mark Twain's. Um, and so, I mean, what would be the most, it's like, okay, I'm going to just tell you, instead of saying, I wrote this great book and it's influenced by, and I created this whole kind of, backstory to it so that you're questioning whether it is or not. As she tried to, with that introduction, purport it as absolute truth and that it absolutely was Twain's ghost.
The
Um,
story of the story deserves to live, honestly. I
the
don't,
story of the story is the best part of the story.
it really is. But you read the novel. Do
And I
you
read the
think,
novel.
do you
It's kind of
think that
boring.
is it? I was going to ask,
Yeah,
what's the quality? If it's not
it's
Mark Twain's book
boring.
and it's just this lady who published it, what happens to it?
If there weren't this introduction, I don't think anybody would ever bother to read it, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
it's interesting. So
Now,
the introduction's the best part.
if you really are really super interested in turn of the century publishing practices and small town newspapers, there are some things in it that are interesting. Um, but there's a lot in it that is just, oh, there's a sickly child, which is another thing. Like, Twain was known to have been a sickly child. So there's a little bit of that in there. Yeah, I don't know. I encourage people to attempt to read it, and I welcome their opinions. But honestly, I have tried to read that thing from beginning to end, I would say about a dozen times. And every time I stop about chapter 7, and
Oh,
then I just speed read the rest. It's like, I'll just read the last paragraph because it's just too
interesting.
boring for me. Um,
Or
and
maybe
that
it's just too mind awakening and you can't handle it as a human
maybe
being,
I
and
can't. It's
you
too
need to
real.
go you need to go
It's just
back
too
into your
real.
light form to
I
fully
know, and
understand and appreciate the words that are coming from the other side,
I
right?
hate to come off like, me of all people. I hate to come across like a cynic because I
But you're
do
not
think
though. You're
I
proving that it's from the other side because you can't read it. You're not allowed to read that stuff. I don't know.
it's in code. It's
It's
from
in
the
code, but it
comics
only seems boring
themselves.
to you. It's written in boring English code.
Yeah, it's
Man, it's
kind of
really
boring.
fascinating. I really freaking love it. And if you ever want to have another conversation about this particular thing, I'm sure there's 1,000 things that we didn't cover. I'm looking right now, trying to pull up Mark Twain's bibliography. There it is.
Oh, it won't be on there.
I know it won't be, but I'm looking to see what he wrote in the latter part of his life to see.
Here's a quote for you while you're looking at that, but this is from the New York Times, July 28th, 1918, Spiritualism in Lawsuit. Case of Harper and Brothers against Mitchell Kennery over copyright on Mark Twain's name. That's what the lawsuit was about, was using Twain's name unlawfully. Um, Harper and Brothers, publishers of the works of Samuel L. Clemens and owners of a copyright of the pen name Mark Twain, based their action on the publication by Mitchell Kennerly of Jap Herron, a novel which, according to the introduction, was communicated to Mrs. Emily Grant Hutchings via the Ouija board. There is no direct statement that Mark Twain's spirit dictated the book. He is not named as author, and on this technicality, the attorneys for Mr. Kennerly might possibly seek to evade trial. But James N. Rosenberg, who has been retained by the defendant publishers, said the other day that the case would be tried on its merits. We will put the issue up to the Supreme Court. He asserted we will have a final ruling on immortality. There's a couple of other great quotes from this article. At the time the novel Jap Herron was about half finished, Mrs. Hutchings said nothing to, was this oh, okay. So there was a person who helped Pearl Coran, sort of the publisher of Pearl Coran. His name was William Marion Reedy, and he was part of well, they say the making of the work of Patience Worth. And they're speculating in this article that Mrs. Hutching knew Mr. Reedy, and that because they were all friends, and that she had told him about it. So in other words, people think that Mr. Reedy sort of helped Patience Worth concoct this whole idea that she was channeling an entity, And he then also came along and did a little sideshow number with Mrs. Hutchings. So that's sort of what they're kind of saying in this. And that was, of course, very common, let me tell you, during the spiritualist movement. One of the most famous groups in the spiritual movement were the Fox sisters.
Uh-huh.
And they were three sisters, two of whom were the psychics, and one was the manager. And they put on a series of stage show / seances that they charged for, that they purported they were communicating with the dead, and they would communicate via a series of rappings, knocking on wood, essentially.
Oh, I've heard that about them before. Maybe it was
Right?
through
They traveled all around. They made a great deal of money. They were incredibly wealthy for the time. One of them was married. I believe it was the one who was the manager, and she was the oldest sister. The other two were not. They were alcoholics. They made a ton of money. Basically, they were partying it up in this 1900s situation. And then they were outed as being you by one of the cousins who was said to kind of work behind the scenes. And these were the ladies who were doing this stuff like, they had a lever to push the table up so it seemed like it was levitating. All those kind of what we call parlor tricks now. That's where the term comes from, doing that sort of sleight of hand in the paranormal parlor. And so because they were disproved, and then you also had Houdini, who was a master and was calling them on their tricks, that you're not the dead aren't moving that. I can see the line from here. And so he was disproving a lot of these things. Not everyone was disproven, but there was this atmosphere that contributed toward the end of the spiritualist movement, that people were basically charlatans just trying to make a buck on the psychic arts in this case. So there's a lot of belief that all of these kind of works after the Fox sisters, after that kind of came crashing down, all of the works of Patience Worth, all of the channeled and trance work was all basically just another version of the sideshow.
I mean, it's an interesting. I love Houdini. I love the idea of him as well, promising to come back from the other side and communicate with his wife, and how they were both kind of skeptics their entire lives until he died, and then she became like all about it, right? And she fall like hook, line, and sinker for the whole spiritual movement after his death.
Well, he was actually sort of toward the end of the spiritualist movement, but I mean, it continued. The concepts of the spiritualist movement continued long after sort of the crux of the movement itself. But he was, he wasn't exact. I mean, he always kind of maintained that there was some sort of belief, but he was, in fact, more adamant about disproving the things that were false, because he didn't. It's just like today. It's like there are legit psychics, and then there are 1-800 blah blah blah, and it costs you $100 and they get your credit card number.
Yeah.
Versus like somebody who legitimately works. The psychic arts are also part of the healing arts, and so there are a lot of people who are sensitive and they're healers, and they seek to use their gifts to help other people and help them, find guidance and things like that. So, you know what? I got to wrap this up, even though I could talk to you for another hour or so. Do you want to say anything in particular, or pick a date? I don't know is there something you'd like to, I didn't know how you like to.
No, I probably would cut. I'll probably cut before many minutes ago.
Yeah, I
think I found the best place for it. But yeah, man, I don't know what the hell's up with you and these really great conversations. I think it's just really great.
I subscribe to your podcast. I haven't listened to I haven't listened to any that I'm involved in, because I have a really hard time listening to interviews with myself. I hate it. I hate listening to the sound of my own voice.
It gets better after like hundreds of hours of trying to edit stuff.
Edit it, right? That's probably why I'm so terrible at it. Now, I don't mind myself as the interviewer. I hate myself as the interviewee.
Oh, interesting.
But, I guess that's like Johnny Depp syndrome or whatever. So let me pull my calendar up here. Old lady, let me pull out my calendar.
So what are you thinking of the podcast? Any criticisms?
I haven't listened to it enough to tell you that. I have a bunch downloaded. But let me tell you something that happened to me. I have a slipped or ruptured disc in my back, and I have been in excruciating pain for about a month now. And so everything that I was working on, so that's why actually I was like I was scrolling through iTunes, and I was like, I need a new podcast. And yours came up with like, if you like this, you may like this. I was like looking at
Hey.
Jim Harold or something. I don't know what it was. I swear I didn't Google myself. And I thought, I should subscribe to this and listen because let me tell you which ones I have on my phone right now that I haven't listened to yet. Uh, where are you?
Really
Well,
makes
there's
me
a
happy.
bunch,
That means the algorithm's working.
right? I know. I was like, oh, wait. The one that I'm really okay, so Speculating on PTSD with Ken Scholes. I
Oh,
started to
okay.
listen to that one. I didn't get very far because I just didn't finish it. And the other ones I saved were the Laura Ingalls Wilder one and
Well,
H.T.
that's the
Chambers. Those
Mirage.
are all, yeah, those are Mirage. But then I also subscribe to Origin. Let me
Oh, good.
see.
Now you're getting them all. Now just put
No,
everything in the
look,
same feed.
actually, no. You know what's weird? Okay, so when you go to Origin, you actually can also get Mirage episodes. Did you
Yeah,
know that? Okay,
I
so
joined them together.
okay,
I was
so
like
is
mad
it
at myself
beneficial
thinking
for
I have all
you?
these great conversations over here, and then I have all those great conversations over here, and I need to get them together. I want them to
So
join.
should I is it better for you to subscribe to both? Because I don't care, I've got
I just kept
256
the other
fucking
feed
megabytes.
going because I didn't want
Okay.
to lose those listeners in case they didn't want, I didn't want to stop Mirage at 20 something and have
Okay,
them
let me
go,
see
oh,
if
boy,
I
that
can't remember
sucked.
if I subscribe to both of them or not. Mm,
For the
alphabetical
longest time,
order.
upgraded my website and I put the
I
service
have
on there.
or okay, no, I'm only subscribed to Origin.
Okay, you're good.
So but if you subscribe to Mirage, you can't get Origin, is what you're saying.
No, you can get both. I mean, it
Oh,
doesn't
you can
matter.
get
You're
them.
gonna get them. You're gonna double up on the Mirage episodes every Friday.
Uh-huh, okay. Well, anyway, I'll let you know.
All right, Alistair Crowley. Let's do that.
Okay, let's see. That's a little bit intimidating because there's people who are so into him, but
We can continue. Honestly, spiritual movement is fascinating, and we could probably continue just having conversations on it. We really don't
okay,
cover a lot of supernatural stuff, though.
if you look in that chapter of that particular chapter,
Hmm.
chapter 3, there are several characters in there that were writers that we could talk about. Not just, but like there's the woman Patience Worth. There's this woman named um oh, what was her name? Mrs. Leonora Piper. And she was supposedly like she was investigated for 15 years as by the Society for Cyclical Research to prove if she was going into trance and whether or not that was legit. And she channeled like Abe Lincoln and this French slave, and basically they like tried to trip her up in every way possible for 15 years, and they were never able to prove that she
Wow,
was anything but going into trance. And she had
interesting.
a tumor, and that's when it started.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a real interesting story. But anyway, we can certainly work Crowley into that. I'm happy to. I mean, like I said, I
Honestly,
know
I
what
just
I
want to
know
call these
about him.
the Varla Ventura conversations because really we just talk about whatever comes up. Even putting a subject on them makes no sense because we just go all over the place. I like it, and I think that starting with an idea like an Aleister Crowley and just going is great. I love
Yeah, and we can totally revisit this and the channeled works and you know what was happening during that time and why people were so interested in documenting what was happening in the afterlife.
the machines were taking over the
Like
lives of people at that point,
right?
right?
Well,
Machines are
exactly. It
coming
was
up.
like in the
The soul was dying.
industrialization and was it you that brought up the fact that suddenly there was a telegraph and then there was a telephone, and how odd that must have been to some pioneer farmer to
Right?
have this thing ringing and you pick it up and there's this kind of a scratchy voice on the other end telling you messages. It's like no wonder no wonder there was such a fascination with communication in general, and that the
Who else can we talk
communication
to? Right? Because that was an element in science fiction too at that time. Who else can we call up?
right. Can
Aliens
we
out
make
there?
contact with aliens? Can we make contact with our loved ones?
Maybe
And
Darwin, man, that would be an interesting addition to this conversation too, because he killed God, didn't he? I mean, he kind of killed the idea of a heaven and that we're made in some superior being's image, and instead he presented the idea that
evolution, right?
evolution, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're arguing
It
against
was
evolution with spirituality. You're saying, okay, no, there is something else out there, and we're
well,
going to
actually,
find it, and we're going to
what
talk
was
to it.
interesting with the spiritualist movement is that it was not in conflict with Christianity. There were many, many people who were stalwart Christians and went to church on Sunday and they went to a psychic salon on Saturday.
Yeah. Oh,
The
wow.
two, it
That's what I'm
wasn't an
saying.
either
When you
or.
talk about
Yeah.
ghosts, you talk about heaven, don't you? You talk about an
Yeah.
afterlife. You talk about a verification of this thing that you've been doing your entire life, meaning shutting off any ideas besides this Bible or whatever. It verifies it. It clarifies it a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Magic, gods, demons, devils. I mean, that kind of makes it okay. And Darwin wrong. Except for the
Yeah.
way Darwin can be wrong. Because you can go to the Galapagos and you can see all those animals and you can see how they changed or whatever the hell he did. I didn't read that. My only experience with evolution is that picture of the monkey turning into the man, and I believe
Yeah.
it wholeheartedly.
Oh, it's obvious.
I'm a complete idiot, and I know nothing about the
Totally.
actual theory, but I'm totally all about it.
It's so clear, right? It's just
Yeah,
like go observe a chimpanzee for an
it would
hour
make
and
sense
it
that
will
people are like,
remind you of
no,
someone you know.
but you have proof. Yeah, exactly. You have proof. It's physical proof that it's happening, and then you turn over here, and there's the Bible that you know was written in King James's time by potentially Shakespeare's contemporaries, if not Shakespeare himself, and nothing else. That's the only thing you got. So now you got to come up with something. So let's try this spiritual thing. It's interesting. Where did that come from, right? I mean,
And
God, I
you
love
know what?
talking to you. I could
I
have
just
like an endless
found
Varla Ventura conversation just
I
happening all
just
the time.
found like 4 articles. So this we can there's a somewhat scathing review of this when it came out. So that'll be we can talk about like the, that aspect of it as well, because the kind of the idea was, did he write it or didn't he write it?
Yeah.
So people were having that debate when it came out as well, so it's kind of interesting. So we
What I
can
love is that you start turning your mind to the subject too, and you start looking up stuff. It's cool.
Yeah, well, I think I had read 1 or 2 of the reviews and I'd read a couple essays, but there's all this kind of it's just a rabbit warren really with the all of these players. They all kind of knew each other. So you get Patience Worth, and then she was in a room with Emily, and then they were in a room with the Fox sisters, and then they knew Houdini, and it's just like this kind of this
Wow.
yeah,
Why
it's like
not, right? It's not going to be a very big community. It's going to be very small because there aren't going to be a lot of people who are writing about it.
and that happens like a lot when I'm writing like did this happen a lot with a fairy book, especially, is that the writers make reference to the works of another writer in their introduction. And then you find that other writer who then makes reference to that person and another person. And soon you can start to see the story behind the story. You see the little parties that they had where they all hung
Yeah.
out, or the conversations that they had, or the influence, the long distance relationships that they had, writing to each other, speaking with one another, and having these kind of debates and conversations and influence on each other. And so there's this kind of you know meshwork back there, and I think you see that with the spiritualist movement as well. They all sort of, it was the same circles really that they
I
all
mean,
ran
we're
in.
talking about a lot of time, right? I mean, we're talking like a lot of your work too comes from that same type of era.
Yeah, absolutely, that's like my era.
Do you write fiction in that era as well?
No.
No, you don't. Where's your
Mm-mm.
fiction placed at? Why am I asking you a question? You just said that you had to go. I'm gonna let you do
Present.
that.
Like
Present tense.
it's the horrors of the present, and not in a science fiction way. In a here's a woman who moved from a big city and experienced some kind of trauma, and now she lives in this small town in the Midwest, and she can't quite shake the feeling that something's watching her, like that kind of thing.
But
And
not nonfiction, fiction though.
fiction, total
That's so
fiction,
fantastic.
yeah, but
So is
based
there a
on
psychological
reality.
element to it? Was she
Oh,
down with the
absolutely.
piano? Yeah.
Yeah. There's a man standing outside the window, then he's not there. There's something in the woods that the dog won't walk past. And these are all things that have happened to me. and then I've embellished them in a very dark and
Oh yeah.
horrifying
What do you
way.
do
So
with them? You send them out to get published, or you just hold on to them?
that one I'm just working on. I've been working on it for, a while. The problem is that
Like about a week?
oh no, like a year.
No, no, no,
Oh,
no. Is that a novel?
eh, it's either a novel or a long short story.
Well, you need to
My
get out
problem is I
there and
don't know
publish
how
it.
it ends.
Oh, that's the bad part.
Yeah, and
Endings
so
suck.
I'm afraid to get like I don't want to get in that because that's what I was saying with the nonfiction. You've got an ending. You can even say the end, dear
Yeah.
readers. In fact, I
Until
think
next
the
time.
last book I was like, death is not the end. I'm going to end this on the death chapter, but there's so much more to say. And but I met my word count, so I'm out. Actually, I think my next book might be in terms of the Varla Ventura, like that series I've been doing with Wiser Books, is I'm kind of thinking pirates, actually.
Yeah,
So
you mentioned that
yeah,
actually. Good
so
idea.
and I just bought myself like basically amassed a library of pirate history. So
The bad
and
thing
I've
about
enlisted
pirates
my
is,
son to help me. I've
oh,
enlisted my son
fantastic. Is he a
because
pirate dude?
well, yeah, I mean, he's just a great reader too. He's reads well above his grade level. And so he'll remember, and he's got this fresh little brain. So he remembers facts and things like that. So he's going to be my research buddy.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Do you are you gonna examine it from like the lore perspective, or like
Both.
what do they call it? God, what am I looking for here? What word? Is it lore? Because I had this whole like jinx thing happening and luck and
Facts, lore, places that you can go, famous battle sites, shipwrecks, all of that. It will be kind of, and it will complement the mermaid book in that way. There
oh
will
cool.
be, but it'll be less fictiony than that. It'll be less like fairy tale. There will be great stories and legends and excerpts and quotes, but it will really be more about like digestible pirate, exciting history.
Are you gonna put your son's name on it?
Yeah, maybe. It depends on how much he does. He'll reap all the benefits.
Yeah.
I'm hoping to get like some paid travel out of it. That's what I'm hoping for. Where you write to
the Caribbean, right?
Write to the Caribbean. You say, "Hey, I'm doing researching this book, and I can put your hotel in it."
Here's a ticket to Somalia. Enjoy yourself.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
If you want to know about pirates, here you go.
We're going to stick with the Caribbean on this one.